Shabbat Shalom and Chodesh Tov, everyone. A good beginning of the month. 3 weeks ago, I was walking through Jerusalem with one of my closest friends. We have known each other for 20 years. He is a child of Palestinian refugees and many years later, an American citizen. It was our first time there together. I thought it would be nice to take a Shabbat walk Friday night to avoid the heat of the day. So we gaily promenaded, as it were, through each part of the old city. After we climbed the steps from the Kotel, the Western Wall Plaza, to the Jewish Quarter, catching a beautiful, beautiful view down below, we were greeted in the Jewish Quarter by a gigantic sign that read, "Make Gaza Jewish again." I found myself mortified beyond mortified to see this sign prominently displayed. And I found myself apologizing both to the universe as a whole and to him as an individual. But on behalf of whom was I apologizing? On behalf of racist people who had hung it? On behalf of the neighbors who allowed it to stay up? On behalf of people who have chosen fear and despair over possibility? On behalf of myself? My friend, however, did not blink. He generously reminded me that the sign was an honest representation of his experience in and of Israel. The past 2 weeks of Israel blocking food to such a degree to people in Gaza do not exist in a vacuum. The past nearly 2 years of Israeli soldiers bombing and shooting children, of Israel enabling Jews to terrorize Palestinians in the West Bank, these things do not exist in a vacuum. And the projects of displacing people from their land, making them second-class citizens, erasing their history, and otherwise dehumanizing them, brings us to this moment. At least, he responded to me, the sign is not pretending to be something that it is not. Sorting through the letters in response to Bret Stephens' op-ed in the Times a couple of days back, Dan Wasserman from Milton, Massachusetts wrote, the stampeding of desperate civilians from one corner to another of a sealed-off territory, the persistent lethal bombing of homes, hospitals, and refugee centers, and the denial of food and medicine to a starving population are not incidental acts. If the historical parallels are too uncomfortable for Mr. Stephens to accept the term genocide, perhaps he'd agree to intentional barbarity. The conversation of whether to call what the state of Israel is doing to Palestinian people genocide is a reasonable one, and one that I want scholars and human rights organizations to have. Most of you know that I love words. Maybe sometimes I love words too much, but I am less interested in the words that we use for the past or the present, and I am much more interested in the truth of the moment, which remains. Jews are starving people in Gaza, and this needs to end. Earlier in davening, as we meditated on what brought us from last Shabbat to this, I am aware that I started this week in Haifa. I traveled through Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Gush Etzion, Hebron, Halhul, and then Amman, Jordan, on my way back to New York 48 hours ago. I've been thinking a lot about the world that could be, a world with peace and justice, integrity and truth, reparations and reconciliation for Jews and for Palestinians in and beyond the land of Israel. For years, I thought and taught that Judaism is not about the world as it is. It is about the world as it could be and should be. Yet the more I have returned to this idea as a guiding principle, the more I have to realize that there is more to it. It is not honest to focus on the world that could or should be without first observing the world as it is, naming what is right in front of us. So I'm going to say it again. Right now, Jews are starving Palestinian people in Gaza. It stings to say it, and I hope it stings to hear it. And we must face this truth without Hamas this and Hamas that. We have to worry about cleaning up our own selves and our own siblings. We have to face this without whataboutisms. We have to face it without both sides isms. Jews are starving people to death in Gaza. Going into this Shabbat, I have been struggling as we move toward the conclusion of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. I'm struggling with the militarism of Parshat Matot, the seemingly lack of compassion for people in the land of Canaan that the Israelites are about to enter. The classical commentaries ask themselves about two actions. Action number one, dispossessing the people currently in the land. And action number two, settling in the land, actually living there. Are these to be understood as mitzvot? Which is more important, displacement or settlement? Certainly, this parasha helps justify the religious national fervor that some Jews use to justify their presence anywhere in the land of Israel, at nearly any cost to other people who are already living there. The irony in the biblical text is that the Midianites, the people who dwelled in the land at the time, were typically criticized for idolatry and for leading the Israelites astray. A crime so egregious, evidently, that the text tells us to do something to them that would probably be called something like ethnic cleansing today. What sort of idolatry could possibly warrant such a response? In his framework that he calls the five-legged table, former Hillel International CEO Avram Infeld teaches that perhaps the most important reason for monotheism is to remind human beings that the job of God is not available. The job of God has been taken. So if we are to believe that there is one God alone, then we are distinctly not God. When people lose sight of this, and many Jewish leaders have, then we can justify anything in God's name because we have effectively appointed ourselves God in God's place. It's a familiar story as Americans, as we watch the rise of some people who self-identify as Christian, also seeming to forget that the job of God has already been taken. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Av. We call this month Menachem Av that comforts. Even before we arrive at the 9th of Av, the Jewish people's national day of mourning. But for most Jews in today's world, even with an uptick in anti-Semitic attacks, we are relatively safe. We are safe enough that this emotional lead-up to Tisha B'Av that our tradition encourages us to have, that this emotional lead-up is self-imposed. It is generally a choice. We try to link our experiences with our ancestors, who tradition says devalued one another's physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being. And we remind ourselves what a horror it is when sexual immorality, idolatry, and murder go from society's cardinal sins to its daily practices. This Av, I want us to allow ourselves to measure the actions of the state of Israel through this lens and act accordingly. 1 week ago, I was honored for us to host Rabbi Jill Jacobs, CEO of Drashah, the rabbinic call to human rights here at CVST, to talk about anti-Semitism against the background of criticism of Israel and vice versa, to try to make better sense of something that often feels confusing, likely purposefully confusing by those who seek to profit by dividing Jews from each other and dividing us from our obvious allies. 2 days ago, Rabbi Jacobs published an editorial in the foreword called "Gaza is Starving. Where are the American Jewish leaders?" Jill writes, "In private, I've heard many Jewish leaders and even more Jewish community members acknowledge their horror at what is happening in Gaza and the worsening onslaught of settler violence in the West Bank. Some past communal leaders have spoken up, but in public, most of the current mainstream leadership presents a united front in which no criticism of the Israeli government or military will be tolerated. Acknowledging any fault by Israel," Rabbi Jacobs continues, "some argue, only gives fodder to anti-Semites and haters of Israel. Combined with the dismay at the growing number of young Jews who define themselves as anti-Zionist, many leaders and institutions have simply redoubled their efforts to insist on Israel's righteousness and to shut out critical voices from the Jewish community. Our own fear must not distract from the reality that the biggest threat to Israel and indeed to Judaism itself, is coming from Israel's governing coalition. Israel is increasingly becoming an autocratic and theocratic state. This is the moment for American Jews, Jill says, including both leaders and ordinary Jewish community members, to raise their voice. And you may have seen in today's forward that Sruli Fruchter echoed this notion, noting the irony that the greatest treason is allowing this starvation to continue. The irony that the greatest treason is allowing this starvation to continue, not admitting that it's happening. One of my favorite parts of traveling in Israel, traveling in Palestine, is the produce of the land itself. Marketplaces filled with citrus, with vegetables, olive oil from Nablus, oranges named for Jaffa, and, true confessions, bakeries that have existed for over a century that know exactly what to do with the choicest produce of the land. During the bulk of my 3 weeks away, I would receive a daily news notification of how many people in Gaza seeking food had been shot by soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces. Jews are starving people in Gaza, and Jews are killing, with guns, people whom Jews are already starving. Sometimes I would get these notifications while I was walking through marketplaces with those choicest fruits and salads, the freshest smelling breads and cakes. Sometimes I felt numb, sometimes nauseated, and sometimes hungry for that food, excited about it, happy to be in a place I love, with people I love, and utterly repulsed that in a tradition that has taken great pains to confront and reconstruct some of its most disturbing parts, so many Jews are using the worst parts of Jewish tradition to say that some people count more than others, to justify killing people slowly, though faster and faster it seems, and shooting people, many children, sometimes point blank. From college campuses to the New York City mayoral election, people have been getting distracted by the question, does Israel have a right to exist? Which, per Sarah Kunstler's Substack on Wednesday, is not so much a question, but actually more of a trap. Does Israel have a right to exist? Kunstler suggests that we are asking the wrong question. States are not sacred, she says. Lives are sacred. Israel already exists. Israel already exists. And while we debate whether or not states have any inherent rights, people are starving to death. So the real question, the urgent question, is not whether Israel has a right to exist. It is whether Palestinians do. Do Palestinian people have a right to exist? I believe, of course, that the answer is yes. I believe that human rights of all shapes and stripes would say the answer is yes. But we have to match our actions to our beliefs. Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, opened by hinting at the idea that some people count more than others, but the tradition is quick to universalize this counting, focusing the imagery away from counting only military-aged men, and instead toward Hashem, toward a God who counts God's treasures, who counts God's people one by one by one in the way that a king might count and look at and recount their most valuable possessions. And in the very last verses of Numbers and Parshat Masei, which we also read this week, we return to another counting, the counting of 5 daughters of Tzlofechad, whose names, Rashi notices, are in a different order entirely than they were back in Parshat Pinchas. The Torah, Rashi says, is trying to teach us that each of them, each one of the 5 of them, is measured the same as the last, regardless of the order of their births, regardless of their marriages or when they were, regardless of anything, every single person has equal weight. So the time is now. The time is now to take a stand that no one counts more than anyone else. The time is now to support direct service to Gaza, perhaps in ways such as supporting World Central Kitchen. The time is now to advocate to our lawmakers. The time has come to advocate to leaders of so-called mainstream Jewish organizations, federations, Hadassah, the ADL, to be clear with them about what is good for the Jews, about what is good for humanity. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Adonai miYerushalayim. For out of Zion comes Torah, and the word of the Eternal from Jerusalem, proclaims the prophet Isaiah before the destruction of the temple. 3 weeks ago on our Shabbat evening walk, my friend and I had a beautiful view of Har Habayit, Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, the noble sanctuary, and talked about the power of the site in Jewish and in Islamic tradition. We talked about how for Jews, the rock over which the Golden Dome was built is associated with the site of the Akedah and associated with the Holy of Holies. Midrashically, it is actually associated with the very center of the universe in Jewish tradition. It is our axis mundi, the place from which creation began. So let us each consider what it would take to restore our holiest places and those who lead them to unbridled centers of goodliness and godliness. And let us act now. Shabbat Shalom.